Welcome into episode 86 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tachek.
Do you buy things? Gas, food, lodging? Do you pay cash for all those things, or do you perhaps work on the barter system? Even if you operate mostly in cash, chances are you occasionally pull out a card of some sort, debit card, credit card, to buy the thing you're buying. But here's the thing, when you pay with a card, you're not just offering money, you're also offering a bit of information. Your name, your address. Hey, would you like your receipt emailed to you? Okay, now the company's got your email. Would you like to join their rewards program? All they need is your phone number. There's probably more data about you out there than you know, and all you did was go to the store to pick up a few things. Of course, that data has value for the companies that collect it and the bad guys that want to steal it. It's that nexus that we're hitting today. Actually, for a couple of days. This is the first of two shows covering the anatomy of a data breach. Items on this week's list: how data breaches happen in the first place, some notable data breaches, and finally, what can you personally do to minimize the risk of a data breach? So let's jump straight to the problem point. I've been shopping, got my new pair of jeans, the store got my money and my email address and my physical address. We're all happy until the data gets out. How does that happen? How does a data breach occur?
Well, as you just said, before a data breach can occur, a company has to be keeping data on you in the first place. And most companies do keep at least some user data. Depending on what kind of data they're storing, a data breach could have kind of a different level of fallout. For example, if a company is only keeping the first names and zip codes for their users, a really minimal amount of personal data would be at risk in the event that a data breach occurred there. However, if a company was instead keeping user information, including first and last names, date of birth, home address, phone number, email address, full credit card number, expiration date, social security number, password, so on, the whole deal, a data breach could put a much larger amount of personal data at risk. Now, those two examples represent the extremes. Most companies store more than a minimal amount of personal data, but they usually don't have absolutely everything, although there have been some notable exceptions, which we'll get into a bit later. Next, the data needs to be stored in an insecure manner in order for a data breach to have a serious impact on affected users. If the data is stored in a secure, encrypted format, following best practices for secure data storage, even if an attacker makes off with that database, they'll be hard-pressed to actually get anything useful out of it anytime soon. On the other hand, if the data is stored in an insecure manner, such as a weak or improperly implemented encryption format, or even worse, if it's stored in plain text with no encryption whatsoever, an attacker can gain access to all of that personal data with relative ease. Okay, so we've established a baseline for what type of data needs to be stored in the first place, and how security of that data storage system can affect the fallout of a potential data breach. But how do the bad guys get into that system to steal the data in the first place? Sometimes attackers have physical access to the company network, either by plugging in directly via Ethernet or through an open or insecure Wi-Fi network. Or if the attacker is actually a company insider, they might just grab the data directly from a work computer. Other times, attackers leverage flaws in a company website or internet accessible system to get a foothold on the company network.
Now, how do they find those? I mean, and this may go back to something that we talked about, golly, I don't know when this show first started, but I mean, you said something about, okay, so there may be an insider who's taking the information. I mean, when you say attackers leverage flaws, you're not talking about phishing at that point. You're talking about just there's a backdoor or a hole that somebody didn't even realize was there.
Yeah, usually scanning the internet for, we've talked previously about Shodan, the vulnerability scanner. Essentially, it's like Google, but you can search for vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. There are things like the Metasploit framework, which is a bunch of different exploits wrapped into a single tool that you can scan the internet with looking for vulnerable systems. There's all sorts of ways that the bad guys can just kind of search through internet connected systems to find the one, it's essentially like, walking down the street trying, jiggling windows and trying to open doors, seeing what's unlocked. So that, yes, it could be a targeted attack where they're specifically saying, I want to attack company A and I'm going to do some reconnaissance and figure out what they're using and go that route. But other times it's just simply a matter of that system was connected to the internet, somebody scanned it, found that it was vulnerable, and went from there.
Okay.
But what you mentioned with phishing is that is also a route that sometimes attackers will go, which is social engineering. Send a malicious attachment with a tempting name or subject line to company employees and hope that somebody will be tricked into executing it on a company-owned machine, and thus they gain access that way. And then finally, data breaches can sometimes occur, and this is kind of almost, I wouldn't say the most common, but it's probably is very common compared to some of the other ones. Is just simply human error in the sense of I accidentally left the company laptop in my car. My car got broken into, and whoever stole the laptop isn't necessarily trying to steal those customer records. They just wanted a laptop to go sell on Craigslist and make some cash for whatever. But in those cases, those usually have a bit of fallout. That's a lot of times you'll hear about the government agencies that lost, a laptop that had 60,000 social security numbers on it or something like that. So just the fact that that's a little bit different and not necessarily a target attack doesn't make it any less bad as far as potential fallout goes for people who are affected, because you don't know where that data ends up. It is important to note that the database containing all of that personal information that the attackers are after doesn't actually need to be connected directly to the internet to be at risk either. Because once an attacker gains a foothold on a company machine, it might be possible for them to move laterally around the company network, looking for other vulnerable machines to exploit. So by working their way from system to system, an attacker might eventually gain access to the aforementioned database of personal information.
I'm sorry, can you give me an idea of how that would work? What might I get into online that would not be all of the personal data, and then how do I hop? Not like I'm looking for instructions on how to do it, but how would that work?
Okay, let's say somebody brings in their home laptop to work because the work security programs wouldn't allow them to access whatever video websites they want to go to. Their device happens to be infected with malware. A bad guy, or it's got a vulnerable operating system or isn't patched or whatever, and a bad guy gets onto that one machine. Or you have, the Internet of Things coffee pot that hasn't been patched in 2 years, sitting in the break room, and somebody gets onto that. Any sort of thing, if you can get onto that network, depending on the security of the network itself, once you're inside, you could, see, is there file sharing going on? Is there a password required to connect to these other systems within the actual network? Is it an easy to guess password? So once you kind of get onto one machine, depending on what not even necessarily a machine, a router, a computer, what have you. Depending on what it is, there are different routes you can go. If it's a router, start sniffing network traffic. If it's a machine, start trying to get into other computers. It kind of depends on the situation. But once you've got that foot in the door, you can start sneaking around inside and seeing what else you can find. And sometimes you have pretty good security on the outside, but on the inside, it's, everybody, here's the company passwords posted in the break room, or emailed in plain text, and they, are able to get that email and see it. So it really depends on the internal security. If a company has some really good internal, if their systems are set up with security software that's going to be monitoring internal connections between their systems and looking for suspicious data and that kind of stuff, that can minimize the risk of, if one machine's compromised, taking down the whole system. But basically, a lot of times you'll have it where there's some good outside defense, but not much on the inside. And there's a slightly different scenario as well, where a company doesn't even necessarily need to have the database on their own network. If they are using the cloud to store the data using Amazon's AWS or a similar service, if that AWS bucket is improperly configured, or if they leave the password lying around in plain text on a machine that subsequently gets compromised on their corporate network, then it's game over because the bad guys can get access to that database and they win.
All right. It sort of felt like, I mean, we've all joked about this before, where you turn on the TV and you've heard that somebody else has lost your data. I kind of don't want to ask this question because I'm worried that somebody listening might find out about a breach that affects them, about which they didn't know. But that's just because I don't want them to have a bad day. I mean, honestly, it is important that we all know about the kinds of breaches that have happened. So let's go ahead and rip off the Band-Aid and talk about some particularly notable data breaches.
All right. Back in episode 51, we covered 5 of the biggest data breaches in history. Even though it hasn't been a year since that episode aired, that list already needs to be updated. However, today we're not just focusing on the biggest data breaches. We're going to cover some that are notable for other reasons as well. Earlier, we discussed how some data breaches can occur if an attacker has physical access to a company network. And in the case of the 2007 TJ Maxx credit card breach, access to insecure Wi-Fi networks was close enough to do the trick. TJ Maxx didn't discover the data breach until 2007, but it dated all the way back to 2005, and hackers actually had access to credit card transaction information dating all the way back to 2003. In all, data for around 45 million credit card and debit card records were stolen by the bad guys. Now, a similar situation occurred with the 2014 Home Depot credit card breach, where attackers gained access to 56 million credit card numbers by hacking the point-of-sale units used for in-store cash registers and self-checkout kiosks. Having your credit card information stolen might seem like a pretty bad situation, but in reality, it's not that big of a deal. You're generally not liable for fraudulent charges, and it's easy to get a new credit card issue once a breach has actually been detected. But what happens when the information used to apply for credit cards in the first place is what's stolen? That worst-case scenario was indeed the situation of the 2017 Equifax data breach, which we discussed in depth in episode 54 of the checklist. Attackers made off with full names, birth dates, addresses, driver's license numbers, and social security numbers, which is more than enough data to steal someone's identity. Another data breach that caused trouble was the 2015 Office of Personnel Management breach. In this breach, attackers made off with records of over 22 million current and former federal employees of the United States. This included the usual stuff like names and social security numbers, but also went beyond that in terms of data you really don't want getting out, such as the fingerprints for 5.6 million people were stolen the attack. Additionally, the stolen data included background check data, such as the 127-page Standard Form 86, which is a questionnaire that needs to be filled out by those seeking federal security clearance. Obviously, the answers to the questions in the background check form would contain sensitive information, such as financial information, potential substance abuse problems, and previous psychiatric care. OPM also kept data such as lie detector results and background on the sexual behaviors of the applicant. An attacker who had access to this data would have immediate and obvious leverage over anyone whose records were exposed.
That's like James Bond level stuff. Well, not James Bond, because he would just come with a gun. But I mean, that's like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy kind of stuff, right? Like you get that kind of information, you're going after a particular guy, and yet you've got, or a particular woman, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be sexist about the whole thing, but assuming that you're talking about only the 5.6 million people that also had their fingerprints stolen, that's still 5.6 million points of leverage that you can get, you know, those people to do just about anything. At the same time, you kind of have to be like Hydra or Chaos or Spectre or something to be able to actually utilize that, I would think.
But isn't part of the reason why they ask for that information so it can't be used as leverage? So, you know, the guys above you already know this information, right?
Yeah, it's partially that. I mean, it's also to make sure, like, say you're filling out the form and it looks like you have a gambling problem. You might not get that security clearance if they think you're at risk for, basically being in a position where you might spend too much money and somebody could be like, hey, I'm going to loan you $100,000 to cover your gambling debts if you do this act of espionage. They want to avoid that in the first place. But yeah, I mean, you're giving the information to your higher ups. They'll know, I guess kind of what buttons to push in a way, or potential issues. But yeah, if somebody else got that information, that can then be used as leverage.
Yeah, that's their way into your organization, or, your way into their way into, something higher up the food chain than you. I mean, it's like a phishing attack, except the work's already been done for you. If you have access to that information. Oh, I could have talked to the secretary about her gambling problem, but it says right here she's got a gambling problem. So I don't have to talk to her about it. I can just go ahead and start with the leverage part. But again, that's like, I mean, at the same, I don't want to minimize that, but I mean, it feels like you have to be talking about it feels like movie stuff. I mean, I'm sure it really happens. I mean, there is a world of espionage out there, but it feels like we jumped from the 101 level to the 301 level. It's like, okay, well, I was out buying a hammer and they got my information all the way to, that guy from Mission Impossible came in on the pulley and hovered over the data and somehow managed to take it back out. And again, I don't mean to make light of that because it's a big thing, but even though 5.6 million, or even how much was it, 22 million people, as far as the OPM breach, sounds like a lot, it's not as much as what happened with Home Depot or what happened with TJ Maxx or what happened with Target a few years ago. And we could just keep listing companies. Anyway, we don't want to end with this just kind of being like a depressing thing. It's like, wow, companies are losing your data. Talk to you next week. Instead, what we want to do is talk about what you can do, because we can't fix companies. The three of us here can't fix companies by ourselves, and we certainly can't fix them in the next week. And, sadly, neither can you. What we can do is start guarding our own data a bit better. What we can do is, personally minimize our risk of a data breach. The question is how?
Well, for the most part, companies will only have as much data as you give them. At least that's the case in a world without Facebook handing your data off to anyone who asks for it. We'll just pretend that's not the case here, though. So try and keep the amount of data you're providing to a minimum. If you're filling out a form online, only provide information for the fields that are required. If they're not asking for your phone number, there's no reason to give it to them. I should say if they're not requiring your phone number. One thing to watch out for here is that the autofill feature for most web browsers doesn't actually check to see which fields are required. It just fills all of them out if it's available, if they have data for it. So it can save you a lot of time compared to typing all that stuff out manually, but go back and delete the information from fields that aren't marked as required before submitting the form. One thing to note here is that some companies do have code running in the background that will grab that information that you enter into the form fields, even if you don't submit the form itself. It's kind of shady. It does happen, so it's just something to be aware of.
It's not kind of shady. It's terribly shady.
Terribly shady, yes.
If I didn't push submit, then they shouldn't have it.
But I think people use it for the abandoned shopping cart features.
That's a lot of times what it's used for in e-commerce.
Like we almost had the sale, but now we could follow up with them with the coupon code. Come back, finish your sale.
Dude, I'm sorry. That still strikes me as wrong. I mean, look, if you want to do that for the shopping cart, that's fine. Don't do it with my personal information. It's not a personal thing that I was thinking about buying, I don't know, that pad of paper from Amazon, that pad of drawing paper. I was thinking about buying that from Amazon. I mean, that's okay if Amazon then wants to come back to me and go, hey, you were thinking about that at $10. How do you feel about it at $7? I mean, that's one thing. Another thing is if I go to some website, I'm thinking about signing up for something, I put in my information and decide, no, on second thought, I don't think I want to spend that money right now, or I don't think I want to sign up for that right now. You're telling me there's a chance they've already got my name and address anyway, because I put it in, but then didn't click, yeah, go ahead and take my information.
Yeah. And then you'll see remarketing ads and everything else for everywhere you go along the internet.
And again, that's kind of like the downside of the autofill is, you have to be really careful what you're actually putting in those forms, whether it's manually entered or autofilled. just because you might be giving the data out to, more data out than you should be. Another thing that you shouldn't be doing is something we've said before, but we'll say it again. Do not reuse passwords. Yes, using the same password means you only have to remember a single password when it comes to logging into your various online accounts, but it's super duper insecure. If only one single site that you have an account on gets breached, you've just provided the bad guys with a way into every single other one of your accounts.
But nobody cares about that site. Nobody cares about me. Why would they go after my stuff?
Exactly. It's not just you. And we've said it before, a lot of it's automated tools that are scanning for these vulnerabilities. Then the bad guys are sharing the databases around online, and who knows who has the data. Yeah. So instead, make sure your passwords follow the best practices when it comes to length and complexity. In the event that a company uses a less secure means of encrypting their password database, a longer and more complex password can still take longer for the bad guys to decrypt through brute force. But obviously, it doesn't matter how strong your password is if a company is storing your password in plain text on their system and a hacker gets in. Then it's, that's on the company at that point. When it comes to password security, we also recommend that you make use of a password manager app. Password manager apps will take care of the heavy lifting when it comes to generating and storing secure passwords, and some can even autofill them for you when you're visiting your various sites and services online. Another thing to do is to keep on top of security news, especially when it comes to data breaches. Now, it takes a bit for security breaches to kind of get big enough to hit the nightly news, so a better bet is actually to follow someone like Brian Krebs on Twitter. Another good resource to check on a regular basis is a website called haveibeenpwned.com, and we'll include the link in the show notes. With that site, you can search by username or email address, and it will let you know if your information appears in any of the data breaches that they have on record. And that's obviously only as good as their data set, but they do a pretty good job of getting their hands on the data from as many of the major breaches as they can.
And now, a word from a not sponsor. Ice cream and sprinkles, potatoes and gravy. Some things just go better together. The same can be said when it comes to an exciting new collaboration between 1Password and Troy Hunt, the creator of HaveIBeenPwned.com. Not bad, right?
No, that is awesome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. They really aren't a sponsor, but what are they doing to tie up?
Well, Troy recently launched a service called Pwned Passwords, which allows you to check if your password has been leaked on the internet. The folks behind the password management app 1Password like the service so much that they created a proof of concept feature that integrates a method to check your password database against the list of stolen passwords provided by Pwned Passwords in a safe and secure manner. The integration doesn't actually send your password in plain text across the internet. Instead, it creates a hash of the password and sends the first 5 characters of the hash to Pwned Passwords. Pwned Passwords then sends back a list of hash passwords that start with those same 5 characters, and 1Password is able to locally check your password database against those hashes. Finally, if you find yourself in a situation where a data breach has occurred and you're concerned about the possibility of identity theft, you have to check out episode 47 of the checklist, where we cover ways you could protect yourself and what to do if your identity has been stolen.
See, I like ending, not really on a positive note, because yes, this starts with your information's gone now. But I do like ending, if your information isn't gone yet, we've talked about ways that you can maybe, keep it from disappearing, but then also what you can do if you find out that happens. As I said at the top of the show, this is really just part 1 of Anatomy of a Data Breach. We're going to be talking more next week about, doing sort of like a case examination of one in particular, and then some other things that companies can do. In the meantime, if you would like to check out, go a bit deeper on today's topic, there's a website that we would love for you to check out. It is securemac.com/checklist. You will find show notes there for this episode and every episode we've done before. And then next week, you'll find links to notes for that show. And then the week after that, for that show. And you begin to get the idea. If you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.